This is my original copy of Final Fantasy VII. Back in the day, I tried to run this on my potato PC. I got sluggish performance, it was crash happy, and a very buggy experience. And on top of that, the included mini soundtrack was very poor in comparison to the PlayStation version, and yet, from the very first summon, I was hooked and developed a lifelong passion for the Final Fantasy franchise. For nearly 4 decades, Final Fantasy has redefined what RPGs can be. Each game in the series tells of a self-contained story within its own world, characters and rules. But there are some things that remain constant: epic storytelling, memorable characters, and of course, unforgettable music. And now, in 2025, there is such a wealth of Final Fantasy available to us, it can be difficult to know where to start. But the first important thing to remember is that, at least for the most part, this is an anthology series, which means you can jump in pretty much where you want to, and you don't need to have experience in what came before. Certainly, there are recurring themes. Themes such as crystals, for example, feature prominently in many of the games. Summons, airships, a character named Sid, Moogles, and with a few exceptions aside, turn-based or ATB combat. And even though the Final Fantasy games do tend to pack a punch when it comes to story, they do seem to offer emotional and stylistic diversity. For example, you could describe Final Fantasy VI as a political drama, Final Fantasy VII as a kind of cyberpunk tragedy, Final Fantasy IX pure nostalgia fantasy, and Final Fantasy X as a spiritual journey. Now, of course, I could go on here, but I'm going to take a break because I think Final Fantasy X is actually a great place to start. Released on PS2, Final Fantasy X brought the franchise to a new generation, and with that, it brought a number of features that we hadn't seen before. It marked a turning point in the series with full voice acting for the first time for its main characters, and yes, this was a bit of an experiment at the time, which meant that some of that acting does come across as a little bit unnatural, a little bit wooden. I don't blame the actors for that, and clearly these are names that are very capable. I think it's fascinating to experience how Final Fantasy's voice acting began, and it still does a serviceable job at helping to immerse you into the world and story. It breathes in that emotional nuance and helps to bring the characters to life in a way that wasn't possible in previous entries. So even though the voice acting wasn't perfect in Final Fantasy X, it was still a massive leap forward in storytelling presentation, setting the tone for every Final Fantasy that followed. And in terms of the presentation of the story, Final Fantasy X is not like a typical open-ended RPG. In fact, it embraces a more focused linear path. And true, that may not be everybody's cup of tea. However, in my opinion, that linearity actually helps to keep the story tight, with the constant emotional beats and steady pacing that we've come to expect from a good Final Fantasy entry. Now, since this video is to encourage first-time players, I'm not going to be offering spoilers here, but Final Fantasy X's narrative does explore deep themes such as sacrifice and faith, destiny, and all while delivering one of the most heartbreaking and beloved love stories across the entire series. The story of FF10 is one that will stick with you long after the credits roll, and the emotional beats certainly pack a punch. Now, more recently, the Final Fantasy franchise has moved into more action-oriented combat gameplay. However, traditionally, the franchise is more known for its turn-based systems. And specifically before Final Fantasy X, combat had evolved into what's known as the active turn-based combat system, and this is where turns would often overlap and you would have to be pretty fast when strategizing your moves because enemies could interrupt your go. However, Final Fantasy X used what is known as the CTB, or the conditional turn-based combat system, which means the focus now is fully on the strategy of combat rather than the player's reaction timing. And as such, the gameplay, whilst it can be extremely challenging, is also very accessible. The game always allows you to see whose turn is next between the players and the enemies, making planning ahead both easy and satisfying, taking the stress out of the planning ahead bit and placing it in other areas. And the combat gameplay of Final Fantasy X is extremely satisfying. In fact, I would argue some of the most satisfying combat we've ever had in a Final Fantasy game. And the ability to freely swap party members in and out of battle in the middle of combat adds that extra depth, but without overwhelming newer players. You can't really speak about Final Fantasy X without talking about the Sphere Grid system. And that's because, unlike many JRPGs, Final Fantasy X doesn't actually have a traditional levelling system, and it's the Sphere Grid that replaces this. Now, it effectively works the same way as traditional levelling, apart from the fact you are given a lot more flexibility. And in a nutshell, it is a board game style upgrade system, and it starts simple. Each character has their clearly defined role, but eventually the whole thing opens up into a full customization. But I think overall, what's attractive about the Sphere Grid is that it's perfect for RPG newcomers, and yet it's flexible enough for advanced players to experiment with different kinds of builds. And there's such a wealth of potential character growth here that if you're just going for a standard playthrough, you probably won't even access more than about 20% of the Sphere Grid. However, if you want to take on the optional content, including the super bosses, you are going to have to get deeply involved in this system, which certainly consumes a lot of time, and Final Fantasy X has one of the lengthiest endgame systems in terms of how much grinding you will be expected to engage in. But the rewards are worth it, with some of the largest amount of optional super bosses that have ever been made available in a Final Fantasy game. One area where Final Fantasy consistently excels is in the soundtracks, and Final Fantasy X adds to this legacy. Now, I wouldn't say that the soundtrack here is my absolute most favourite in the franchise, but that's only because the standard is set so high, it still offers an absolute banger. And there are some great contrasts between the different tracks, from the haunting to Zanarkand to the battle-ready Otherworld. Nobuo Uematsu does what he does best here, and his compositions add emotional weight and timeless atmosphere to every single scene. And even though Final Fantasy X soundtrack isn't my personal favourite, there are many who would disagree with me there, and there's no question really that it has played a huge part in what gives this game its identity and its long-lasting impact. But another reason I'm recommending that Final Fantasy X is probably the greatest introduction to the franchise today, and I think this is often overlooked by others, is that quite simply it is available on so many platforms and devices, with newer Final Fantasy games often having really limited exclusivity on specific Sony consoles for extended periods of times when they release. It's nice and refreshing that we can have a Final Fantasy game that you can pick up and play on virtually any device. Now, of course, the original came out back in the day on PS2, but the game has since been remastered and is available on PS3, PS4 and PS5, the Xbox consoles, Nintendo Switch and by extension Switch 2, and it's also available on PC. And by the way, Final Fantasy X works great with the Steam Deck. So however you're gaming normally, chances are you can pick up Final Fantasy X and get stuck straight in. But the remaster itself has also done a brilliant job at updating Final Fantasy X in just enough ways to keep it relevant for a modern audience. And aside from the updated visuals and now full widescreen support, we have a fully remastered orchestrated soundtrack, which sounds stunning by the way, although if you don't like it, you can switch back to the original in its place. There are autosaves, which have actually saved my bacon a number of times, I can tell you that, and there are optional gameplay enhancements included in the remaster, such as the ability to fast forward with turbo speed, turn off encounters, and you do get both the original and expert Sphere Grids that were first released back in the International Edition. So effectively, it has never been easier and it has never been more convenient to play FF10 in 2025. And that has to count for something. So as I'd been scripting this video, I was of course thinking about all the reasons that make Final Fantasy X such a fantastic part of the franchise's legacy. And it got me thinking about the themes of this game, because Final Fantasy X is much more mature than people sometimes expect it's going to be going into it. Again, don't worry, I am keeping this spoiler free, but it deals with ideas such as religious devotion, the weight of tradition, personal loss, and perhaps most poignantly of all, Final Fantasy X does a great job, I think, at getting us as the player to ask ourselves, how much are we willing to give up for others? And these aren't surface level things that the game sort of brings up but then is scared to get into. No, they are baked right into the world building and the mechanics and the arcs of the characters. And I'm not just speaking of the main character here. And yes, Tidus' story is important, but every party member in FF10 is carrying something, some baggage that they bring to the table. Even Riku's chirpy optimism is actually hiding an inner conflict. And these aspects are not simply an insignificant subplot, they are a core reason as to why everything ends up unfolding the way that it does, and a core reason as to what makes Final Fantasy X such an incredible and I would say important game to experience. So to wrap up, Final Fantasy X is a fantastic first entry, a first foray into the franchise. It's emotionally rich, very easy to pick up and play, but has a lot of depth to it once you start to get into it. And the fact that it's available to play almost anywhere as well is a great bonus. It's the perfect entry into one of the greatest gaming franchises of all time, but I want to know, would Final Fantasy X be your first Final Fantasy if you could choose today? And if not, which game would you recommend to newcomers for their first foray? Make sure as always to share your own thoughts down in the comments, that's really appreciated, and I'll certainly read all of them and try and engage where I can. Don't forget to drop a like on this video to see future content that's similar, and I'll catch you next time. Take care, folks.